Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry, high school history teacher, and your king today. Welcome back to another History Teacher X video. All right, you guys have been spamming me to cover the latest Alternate History Hub video. It's called, What If England Never Became French? I'm sure a lot of our English viewers don't appreciate the framing of that question, but I think you know what they're talking about. All right, video is linked down below. Please support that. Check that out first. Then come on back, watch it with me. Let's learn, and I'll let you know what I think. By the way, the latest History Showdown episode has been scheduled for this upcoming Thursday. That says February 6th. And we're doing Military History Night with the Fat Electrician, Habitual Line Crosser, and Chris Cappy from Task and Purpose. Links will be in the description. You will not want to miss that one. All right, let's get started. All right, let's see what happens if they don't invade England.
William the Conqueror, a lord across the Channel who invaded and united the Seven Kingdoms.
Dressed for the occasion,
Sound
by
familiar?
the way.
It should. George R. R. Martin drew a lot of inspiration from a multitude of historical events for his series.
By the way, do you consider William more Viking or more French? Let me know what you think down below.
Especially British history. Yet, sadly, in our real history, William's conquest didn't feature any dragons. He was still pretty effective, though. The Battle of Hastings in 1066 is one of the most defining engagements in world history.
Right.
And it almost...
A lot of people refer to it as almost like the founding of the modern England.
Went the other way. William's horse was shot down in the middle of conflict. Instead of retreating, he mounted a new horse, rallied his troops to fight on, and that horse was shot down as well. Ouch. Usually this would cause...
Have you ever wondered in war movies and stuff why they don't shoot the horses more? Is that just like seen as just disrespectful? Because like you take down the whole person.
The leader...
I feel bad for the horses though.
...to be injured or flee in panic. But like Jon Snow, William had plot armor. He won the day, took the throne, accidentally burned down half of London during his coronation, and went back home to Normandy. Not realizing that he had just changed our history forever. England, after all, was a relatively new kingdom, one on the edge of Europe, ruled by Anglo-Saxons, raided by Vikings.
Right. How they were just booting out, you know, the Vikings and stuff.
How influential could one battle truly be? Very influential, it turns out.
For English history.
So, what if in an alternate timeline, William lost that influential battle?
One thing I want to look at is what kind of global ripple effects does he do with this? Because a lot of the videos, you know, that Cody here covers do have massive ripple effects across the planet. I wonder if you can really get to that level as he has in a lot of other videos.
What if William the Conqueror never conquered England? Today we perceive Britain as this impenetrable island that many wished to conquer, but never could. It's a well-earned reputation after what happened to the Spanish fleet, and Napoleonic fleet, and aborted Operation Sea Lion, and those aliens. Here's the thing though, there was a time this wasn't the case. Prior to Britannia ruling the seas, anyone with a fleet could theoretically sail to England and claim it for themselves. The original Celts were conquered by the Romans. The Romans were squashed by the Anglo-Saxons, from which we get the name England, and the Anglo-Saxons were pillaged and ransomed by the Norsemen, and some of those Norsemen decided to stay. Speaking of ancestry, this video is sponsored by MyHeritage. What a segue. MyHeritage is the #1 family history service, which is why this is my third time collaborating with them.
I've been doing a lot of this the last few
No better service helps you uncover your very own past and rediscover connections lost to time.
Ancestry.com.
You know, like the Norman war crime.
That's a really interesting thing.
It's not a one-time thing. It's something that keeps growing. I did some video or information is uncovered.
Like commentary and a lot of stuff in Discord and things about
is just
family history. I was on Genealogger's site. He actually went through my
watch as it begins
family history with me because he's a professional genealogist.
MyHeritage can add entire lines that you didn't even know existed. Whole new paths to uncover. Like
I suggest doing this stuff.
It's been in Ohio for like 2 centuries. Like that specific part of Ohio, really since Americans first got there. Which is actually very funny because they never really left. Go Buckeyes. Pretty sure another section of my family is from Canada.
I was able to confirm, for example, that I have a lot of ancestry. They were in Russia, but they were the Volga Germans. They were those Germans that came over with Catherine the Great when she, becomes Empress of Russia, and brought in, and encouraged a lot of German migration to settle areas around the Volga River. But it was interesting because I did the DNA test and no Russian shows up in me. And that's because those Volga Germans basically settled and built German community and just interacted with people from Germany. They're just living, a couple thousand miles to the east.
Like a small section. a great-great-aunt. Most, however, just remained in Upper New York since colonization. Really, in the grand scheme of it all,
really
for
fun
the
to
last
look at,
few
though.
centuries, my family moved a lake. There are
33 billion plus
historical documents on MyHeritage to find records of your members. Use their top-notch photo-enhancing software to enhance old pictures, or even animate them to bring old memories to life.
Okay, that's getting too creepy.
Sign up for a 14-day free trial by clicking
Animate
the
him in a
link in the
bathtub
description to enjoy all the amazing features MyHeritage has to offer. So once again, special thanks
a couple
to
services, but not
for
that one.
sponsoring this video.
Is that one better than
Sign up
Ancestry
using
and
the link
Genie?
below and begin your family discovery today. Each one of these groups was like a patch update to this land, fundamentally altering the demographic and cultural composition of southern Britain.
Yeah, because that England becomes like a mutt, right, of all these cultures. Anglo-Saxon, you had the Viking, you had the Britain, you know, indigenous folks, Celt, Roman.
Which for millennia had been seen as kind of a backwater region on a backwater island. Not for the Anglo-Saxons, though, who made this island their home. And that home was under attack.
Like, what is
the
this
period
from?
of intense Viking raids had hardened the Germanic Anglo-Saxons, forcing them to adopt heavy measures. To fight off such an existential threat, the Anglo kings concentrated their power, levied taxes, built ships, and raised mighty hosts to fend off a great heathen army. While most of Europe was incredibly decentralized, this dire situation forced England to fortify.
Age of feudalism here, right? A lot of small groups there, loyal to a local lord than, you know, a far-off monarchy entity. Monarchical.
Fast. In 924, the Seven Kingdoms were finally forged into one. Although, even still, the powerful earldoms made up of shires each had their own regional customs and culture. Many had Christian traditions that were still intertwined with pagan practices.
I love that period of history where the Vikings are pretty much like adopting, and I guess, you know, with these folks too, but especially the Vikings were adopting Christianity, but they still weren't like letting go of some of their like Norse mythology. It's really cool. We're going to a Viking exhibit, Natural History Museum, and they had these cool artifacts where they had, you know, like crucifix necklaces. And what was cool about it is you had like the crucifix, and then one end of the crucifix had Thor's hammer. So it was like Thor's hammer and a crucifix. They were like combining the two. I thought that was a cool like syncretism of the beliefs as you can see they were kind of shifting. Very cool.
Despite swearing fealty to the new Rex Anglorum, or King of the English in Latin, there was still a power struggle between the earls. The idea of a single unified realm was a fairly new concept to England.
Feudalism.
They were going to have to get used to it. Despite that little hiccup, though, things remained relatively stable for a while. About a century or so.
Then,
a few generations later, there was Edward the Confessor, who reigned for 24 years. He was a saintly king. His era was marked by peace. But you know what they say, it's all fun and games until the king dies. With no great desire to expand his kingdom, or produce royal heirs, or put down the numerous schemes his nobles were hatching, Edward's death in 1066 led to a little bit of a family squabble, a medieval succession war. Normally, succession wars are very bloody family affairs, but unlike other European kingdoms, England had something different. England had the Witan. What's a Witan, you wonder? Well, it was a primitive form.
Is this some newer animation style? I haven't seen quite this with kind of the depth and the parallax. I love it.
Of election, where a council of wise men elected their next ruler. Kings and archbishops could only nominate contenders. It was this election, and this election alone, that was the deciding factor. The Witan was what elected the very first king of England, the Rex Anglorum.
I like the AE combination with those letters there. Eighth. It seems like it's like Elvish.
And 100 years later, in 1066, the Witan once again voted for a new king,
William the
unanimously selecting Harold Godwinson. Thing is, though, the throne was claimed by someone else, Harold Hardrada.
Right.
Yes, there was a Harold and a Harold. I'll try to make this as least confusing as possible. Just remember that Harold with an A was a Viking legend.
Oh, there it is. There's the Hagia Sophia. Yeah, the Vikings used to siege Constantinople. You know, when they got bored or they wanted stuff, you sail down the rivers and make your way down to the Black Sea, and then go to the Bosphorus Strait, go sack Constantinople, take some stuff, I think there's even, if I remember right, in the Hagia Sophia, aren't there some like Viking inscriptions? They sack the city, they go in the Hagia Sophia, and they're like, Thor was here, and write that in there. I think there's some evidence of that. That's really cool. Yeah, historically.
If you've never heard of Harold Hardrada before, he was the guy.
Yeah.
An adventurer who fought Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, and Norse, became king of Norway. And
see, I'm not the English history savant like Chris from Vlogging Through History, but even I know about good old Harold.
Now wanted to add the English throne to his list of titles. He was so great that after his death, the Vikings just decided to give up on the whole pillaging thing.
I want a lot of your help in the comments with this video.
Wait a second.
Teach me.
Is that another fighter entering the ring? Oh my god. It's William of Normandy. William had spent the last 2 decades putting down rebellions and fighting against Britain and the French crown itself. Now he was ready for the ultimate challenge, for which he gathered an army of 7,000 men, including 2,000 elite heavy cavalry. All across the coast of his duchy, shipwrights got busy constructing his new armada. On the opposite shore,
is it normie of me to say that I do get confused when I hear some of these titles of like nobles of like, you're the Duke, oh, and you're the Earl. It's like, okay, what's the difference?
Godwinson was ready to defend his crown and spent day and night on the defenses in southern England. But that's when one of the most random events in history unfolded. You see, despite its short length, the English Channel is notoriously dangerous to cross. When we're talking about transporting 7,000 troops in one go, that is only possible between May and September. Everything outside of that would be like trying to cross over lava, and everyone knew it. Edward the Confessor died in January 1066, after which William instantly began working on his new fleet, a fleet which would be ready at the start of September. Problem is, strong winds prevented him from departing, so for weeks the armies of both Godwinson and the Bastard waited for the weather to clear. In the meantime, Hardrada decided to spice things up, sailing across the North Sea and landing in Yorkshire on September 8th, accompanied by the former Earl of Northumbria, Tostig.
You'd think that it being such a short distance, like the weather patterns and stuff wouldn't matter as much, but they did. Even go to like World War II and how certain missions and stuff were so dependent on the weather conditions, again, of a small strait, a very small state, a few miles, in some parts, if you're at like, by Calais.
September 8th, accompanied by the former Earl of Northumbria, Tostig. Their combined force was enormous and threatened to restore the Danelaw to England. Godwinson took a risk, force marching his men 185 miles in 4 days in order to confront Hardrada, exhausting the Anglo-Saxon army. In his mind, the window of opportunity for William had closed. The next time William could even challenge his rule was next year, in May 1067. By the time he arrived, York had already fallen, and
York was the last holdout of the Vikings too, kind of founded, by them.
His earls were defeated. The situation was bleak. Hardrada was a living legend, and yet, despite all the odds, the Anglo-Saxons succeeded, vanquishing the Northmen at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Hardrada and Tostig lay dead on the battlefield, and out of 300 ships used to transport his army, the remnants only managed to fill 24 of them. So imagine you're Godwinson. You secured the throne. You rushed to the north and defeated the most legendary warrior of the day.
But then you got to worry about the south.
Only to then be delivered the news that the Bastard landed on your shores 3 days after your triumph.
You had no time to celebrate. That was such a momentous thing because the Viking Age lasted centuries, and for the Anglo-Saxons to be able to finally rid them, it should have been something that they would be speaking about forever, and go down in their mead halls of mythology. And nope, guess what? William the Bastard showing up
alongside 2,000 battle-hardened knights, who will define the military meta until the arrival of gunpowder. The Normans secured the beachhead and began raiding the countryside,
about 3 centuries
to lure
away.
the Anglo-Saxons, who were now marathoning back south. On April 14th, 1066, at the Battle of Hastings, the Viking shield wall met the Norman heavy cavalry charge. and it lasted the entire day. The Anglo-Saxons were putting up a good fight, but when Harold took a stray arrow to the eye, his men scattered, something which could have easily gone the other way.
By the way, if you didn't know, if you took an arrow in battle, you know, like in movies and stuff, they'll be like, oh, I got hit with an arrow. Okay, I'll take it out and I'm good. No, like arrows were fatal. Like you usually died. The thing's going to get infected. They're designed in a way that once you do take them out, they're designed to rip apart as much flesh as possible. And again, in an arrow, we don't have antibiotics and stuff. It was basically a slow death sentence to get hit by an arrow. All right. Don't believe the guy in Skyrim that was just like, you know, I used to be an adventurer, but I took an arrow to the knee. No, used to be alive until you took an arrow to the knee.
Overnight, the bastard transformed into the conqueror. There were no other battles. England was his. Remember that list of invaders of England? It's fascinating to examine who made the biggest impact on the island's culture and demographics. Was it the Romans who built cities, forts, and roads? Was it the Anglo-Saxons who dominated for centuries? Was it the Norse who caused the former to unite and develop their military and administration? Nope.
Nobody ever cares about Wales. Huh?
Not even close. Just 7,000 men who inherited the kingdom and sprung up the majority of its dynasties dominated every aspect of Anglo-Saxon life. Pretty much everything we know about medieval England relates to this new version of it. Okay. Stone castles? Norman. Heavy cavalry?
True.
Norman. Powerful navy? Norman. Feudalism in England? Norman. Architecture, law, literature.
I mean, I guess, so he's saying it wasn't a feudal structure before the Normans came. I guess in the classical sense that we do see it, because it does come out of, like, I guess, modern day France, with the warfare of mainland France, things like castles, again, being such a big deal until, you know, gunpowder comes along. That technology comes from, you know, Asia, where they pretty much, you know, castles become obsolete with the invention of gunpowder. But back before then, you know, it was mostly you had your longbowmen, and that was like just an incredible achievement for the English. This is 7 Years' War stuff too, though. But yeah, I maybe we have to call it something different than feudalism, but at least in a lot of that classical sense.
Religion, all of it imported. Architecture, law, literature, religion, all of it imported by the Normans.
Language.
And when I say Normans, I really mean the French. And when I say the French, I really mean French adjacent. The Normans.
Okay, that's what I was saying. Because, like, French, is it France? It's not. Right? Even the ancestry, again, coming from them, they're not ancestrally that far removed from not even being from France, you know, the Normans. So, yeah, another mutt. You got to totally get rid of all your conceptions about the modern nation state of Europe. You got to forget that until, like, I mean, definitely after the Crusades, probably at least to like the 1200s or so. Otherwise, you're just not getting a good view of it. I mean, feudalism was such a stronger concept than the idea of a large nation state.
Weren't descendant from the Franks or anything. They had a distinct
They're not Franks,
of their own. They were descendant
folks
from the Norsemen, after all, which is how we got the name. Yeah. But they did speak a variety of Old French, and compared to the Anglo-Saxons, well, they might as well have been French. That's all that matters. When William was crowned in Westminster Abbey for the first time, the ceremony was in French, and French continued to be the language of the elites until 1362. The Old English language basically went underground for 3 centuries, at least in formal occasions. The peasants could speak whatever they wanted, who cared? But just think about that. I mean, for a longer span of time than the United States has existed, the main language of England was French. It's kind of a shame we lost the great Anglo-Saxon names of Ethelstan, Edwig, Ecgfrith, and Cadwalla. Now,
well, this is where it probably, and correct me if I'm wrong, linguists here, a very different French than we probably see today. Just like how English, you know, was very different.
we'd have a millennia of Edwards, Charles, and Georges. What a pity. When it comes to the Normans, history truly is written by the victors, and William did everything in his power to enforce that idea. He commissioned the Bayeux Tapestry, giving his rendition on events, and why he just had to replace the Witan with an absolute monarchy.
Put that in my room.
He replaced 90% of all lords and bishops in England with loyal Normans, and he dotted the land with castles, a move which allowed for less than 10,000 people to enforce their will on 2.5 million. This land would be reshaped in their Norman French image. When the dust settled, the culture propagated by Charlemagne was nearly homogeneous from York to Naples.
Oh man, isn't that a giant overstatement? Because he's still talking about the reality though of the Normans actually doing this. Isn't this video going to be them not coming there? The Charlemagne, I mean that Charlemagne era was gone. I mean, that again, that goes back to 800. Like, it had already fallen apart by then. Definitely not homogenous.
From Bordeaux to Budapest, a feudal west with greater ties to the papacy. So, in such an alternate timeline where William loses, obviously none of that happens. Much of what we think of as England today would be lost, but also much would be gained. Without William, England would still exist, but it would go into the second millennia as something different, something untouched by French influence, an alternative, more Germanic England in both culture and institution, one that in this scenario isn't wiped away. It's an alternative 1066. Instead of Harold Godwinson and his family laying dead on the battlefield, it's William and his followers. Godwinson was king. His family controlled 3 earldoms, while the rest were extremely loyal to him. He had 2 sons, martial experience from fighting the Welsh, and especially after defeating 2 of the most badass warriors of the age. Like his predecessor Edmund, who also fought off invaders, Godwinson is nicknamed Harold Ironside and begins consolidating his rule. So one of the most fascinating aspects of this scenario is that the Witan, this election council, would remain preserved, although the Anglo-Saxon practice of slavery would remain as well.
Who makes up that council, by the way? I mean, he talked about it was like these wise men, but were they former advisors or something? Let me know. I have no idea.
It wasn't so much that William abolished slavery, he never outright did. It was just that Anglo-Saxon society relied much more on slavery for labor, while Western Europe relied on servitude. While some peasants, criminals, and war camps...
I mean, even some of those definitions are pretty small. When you talk about, if he's talking about like serfdom, I mean, serfdom is pretty much the next step away from slavery. Or it's not like the chattel slavery, or even seen the way that we see chattel slavery and like slaves as property in some cultures, but you are bound, I mean, legally bound to that land.
Captives are still enslaved in this alternate timeline. English women, ironically, would have the right to hold property and inherit land, something that William took away. So it was a give and take. It's most likely that eventually slavery would come to an end in England, just not as quickly as it did with the dramatic reforms of the Normans. And speaking of which, one of the reforms of the Normans was to give England stronger ties to the Catholic Church. You see, in our timeline, William...
I mean, they're going to be strong with the Catholic Church in the other scenario too, because it's going to go all the way through King Henry VIII. I mean, defender of the faith, right? Really up through the Reformation, but maybe stronger in this case.
Invasion was stronger ties to the Catholic Church. You see, in our timeline, William's invasion was actually sanctioned by Pope Alexander II. Despite being officially Christian and Catholic, the Anglo-Saxon Church had some influences from the native cultures that had only recently been converted. There were still many Celtic and Germanic influences within the English Church.
I mean, that's going to happen because you're still talking about earlier years of this being imposed. I mean, obviously, the more connected you're going to be, the less isolated, though, you're going to be, the more connections you're going to have to that source. But, you know, it can hold a lot of beliefs that are indigenous. Islam was like that. You know, when Islam made its way to sub-Saharan Africa, it combined a lot of intrinsic beliefs from, you know, the indigenous peoples added to, you know, to Islam. And then even Christianity kind of doing that too. One of the greatest examples was Ethiopia and the kingdom of Axum, which Christianity went there right in the first centuries of Christianity being legalized. And then it got cut off from the rest of the world. And then, you know, come back centuries later, and they got a very interesting form of sort of Christianity going down in East Africa.
The island was removed from the continent in that sense, and the papacy despised it. It was pretty much an island of pseudo-paganism. The last few popes, in fact,
like the Roman
wanted
Empire.
something to be done about the Anglo-Saxons, and that's where William came in. This wasn't to say the church had no influence. They did. Years earlier, Alexander II was able to sway the Witan to elect the previous king, Edward the Confessor, a king who would go on to become a canonized saint because of his piety. He was a direct inspiration for Baylor the Blessed. Thanks,
saints?
George. And while he's still celebrated in 2 churches today...
That's the dumbest crown I've ever seen. Like, look at mine. Mine's way better. Come on. Was it really like square like that? Lame. It also looks, this also looks kind of Eastern. This feels like it belongs in like Eastern Orthodox.
At the time,
their artwork was way better with their
Christian
stuff, in my opinion.
One that William had to fill. Otherwise, the ironically named Godwinson would rule instead, and the pagan influences would continue. So what's the deal here? Would it really be that big of a deal for the church if Godwinson had won instead of William? Yeah, probably. For one, Godwinson would know the Pope specifically sponsored another rival to depose and kill him. For another, Godwinson...
Pope, more like poop. Am I right? Got him.
Did not implement the reforms that the church had been wishing for. So from the Pope's perspective, England was still out of line. Either way, without the Normans, the church doesn't implement massive reforms within England. They don't build new monasteries. And if you really think about it, reintroduce true Latin Catholicism to England. This can go 2 ways. Either Godwinson or his successors eventually make up with the church and do the reforms the popes wanted at the cost of their own kingly autonomy, but with some nice political points. Or this divide... This
was where the Catholic Church was really invested in this kind of stuff. As the church is becoming more and more popular through these early Middle Ages, trying to find loyalty to those places. And if you were, a leader looking to centralize power, the greatest ally you could have in this era was the Catholic Church. I mean, you saw that with the Franks, right? When they convert to Christianity, and you see what happens with, like with Charlemagne. That was a powerful tool, and some rode that tool all the way to sort of like the modern era. We're talking about French Revolution in one of my classes, and how strong the Catholic Church influence was on pre-revolutionary France all the way up to the end with the execution of Louis XVI. It was state religion, and they fed off of each other. They empower each other.
Between the Anglo-Saxon Church and the Church of Rome gets even greater. Britain isn't just culturally different from mainland Europe without the Norman French, it could be religiously different as well. And that's a more interesting scenario, so I'm going with that.
It's more
possible
connections
we could
to
see
pagan
an
beliefs.
orthodoxy-like split from Rome, but with Celto-Germanic elements. Much like how the Greeks split with the Latins, gradually distancing over culture until it was too late to mend the differences.
So unlike the East, where it becomes Christianity becomes Greekified, but also Russified when it heads its way up to Russia, this would become like Celtified.
The archbishops of Canterbury and York, in a way, become like the patriarchs of the East. Perhaps they become the patriarchs of the North. Perhaps instead of the Protestant Reformation centuries later, Northern Europe just splits now under a more unified Northern Church, unified in their Germanic culture. Could this spawn a crusade? Perhaps, but it really depends on when this split happens and how quickly.
I like this because we're now looking to see if this does affect major European events like the Protestant Reformation. I don't know about that, because probably not, because, if you're talking about like Martin Luther, his response was to the Catholic Church, it was to the Roman Church that way, and wouldn't have probably been as connected to this form of Christianity. That's my original thought, but we'll see.
Perhaps, but it really depends on when this split happens and how quickly. I will say, for the most part, I can just imagine this being one more branch disconnecting Anglo-Saxon England from the mainland. We'll leave it at that. In the next 5 years of this alternate timeline, Harold consolidates his kingdom, rallies his men to finish the job he started in Wales. The Normans performed a similar maneuver in 1081, taking the less mountainous South Wales, and the same happens here, albeit a little sooner. The lesson is no matter who controls England, the Welsh always lose. Harold would plunder 2,000 sets of heavy armor, training his own regiment of heavy cavalry, which combined with his shield wall, harkened back to the hammer and anvil tactics of Alexander the Great. Tens of thousands would be taken into slavery. Then he would turn his sights north against the Gaelic Scots. Scotland, as always, was a thorn in the English side, and their kingship raids was something the Anglo-Saxons had to put up with for centuries. Each time a new Scottish king ascended the throne, he'd go on a raid, plundering neighboring English lands.
I would assume the whole rivalry between England and Scotland would still remain. I can't imagine anything would have changed in this timeline.
Already on shaky grounds with the Pope, Harold Ironside would march his men north yet again, crushing all resistance in his path.
So it'd have more success,
the parts of Scotland were no interest to him, not to mention impossible to tame. Instead, he takes Carlisle, Edinburgh, and Glasgow, before making Malcolm III the Earl of the newly created Cumberland. It's important.
Do you guys agree with this success here in Scotland that he's having? Let me know, because I know a lot of you know a lot more about this specific time period here than I do.
To note that in our timeline, William made similar moves, but the reason why this is so significant is because in this alternate timeline, nobody genocides the North. In our timeline, the last Anglo-Saxon resistance remained alive and well in the land of Northumbria. Supported by Danes overseas, the Anglo rebels killed William's newly appointed Earl. And William kinda lost it. He went into a frenzy. This is what historians now call the harrying of the North. But it's something that I as a YouTuber call killing everyone. Throughout the North, entire communities were put to the sword. Nobody was spared. Dang. This was a vengeance that was personal. Laws were passed just to devastate Northumbria, and some counties lost 75% of their population. It's estimated that 100,000 people died as a result of starvation and murder.
And again, that's crazy because you're talking about rural populations, and it's also 1,000 years ago. It's like, those are insane numbers. It'd be like millions today.
While many others fled to Scotland. Honestly, this is the one time when the thing George copied from history ended up being less brutal. Like, when Aegon conquered Westeros, he burned a field and a few nobles, but the average peasant was spared. William did not do that. Entire regions were wiped out.
But on this timeline,
this foreign Norman brutally reshaped Anglo-Saxon England in his image. These tactics were so effective that, to this day, most people see William as the founder of England rather than the noble that took it over, something that his epitaph truly entails.
Sure.
In this alternate timeline, Harold, already being the king, had no reason to set fire to a huge chunk of his country. He defeated both foreign invaders. In fact, instead of being completely nuked, the semi-autonomous Northumbria actually remains extremely prosperous. So what would the future hold for this alternate England? That is really just England as it would have been already. Is that?
I mean, is that not saying though that, like, okay, if Anglo-Saxons stay in control and you don't have the Normans going up and genociding that whole region, who's to say that in this timeline the Anglo-Saxons wouldn't have done maybe not something to that extent or that violent, but something still like that? You know what I mean? Okay, let's see what he says.
Everything just peaceful now? Of course not. It's just instead of wars being fought inside England to get rid of rebels, England goes on the offensive. When we look at expansionist kings, they rarely tend to stay put after a few successes. And Godwinson, now Ironside, would be no different. The Anglo-Saxon kings had a deep connection to lands across the sea. And just as William of Normandy tried to claim legitimacy in another land, Harold might try to do the same. He was a descendant of Canute the Great after all, and Harold might wish to also possess two crowns. I could imagine that with so much success and stability on the home front, Harold might emphasize his connection to Olaf II Haraldsson.
That makes sense. You got to get some reinforcements there. Might as well go to your cousins, Olaf,
former king of Norway, arguing his own legitimacy for the crown. Maybe he even tries to claim it through an invasion of Denmark. Instead of seeing a period of castles and exploitation under William, Harold instead attempts to unite the Danes and Anglo-Saxons under one banner.
I don't know about this idea though that like the English just like wouldn't figure out castles. You know what I mean? Like it would just be this crazy foreign concept. You know what I mean?
Sailing an armada of 300 ships against Sweyn II.
Here they
Sweyn
come.
had spent most of his rule dealing with religious matters and fathering over 20 children out of wedlock. His military record was poor.
Come on, man.
And he didn't stand a chance against this force of Anglo-Saxons.
Back to the live footage.
If there was a time to take Denmark, it was now. It's kind of funny, imagining the English being the one raiding Scandinavia.
Nah,
how this goes, who's to say? But if he was successful, just like Canute the Great, Harold Ironside would hold 2 crowns by the ripe age of 50.
See, I originally just thought he was gonna say just the the Danes are making an alliance with Olaf or whatever, and then they come over and start resettling once again, and maybe use that to fight up north towards Scotland. But it looks like it's like the reverse.
Following the ancient customs, his sons were deeply involved in the politics of the crown. And since they had a strong connection to Ireland, it's easy to assume that the eldest, Godwin Haraldson, might take it upon himself to expand Anglo-Saxon influence to the Isle. Given Godwin's familiarity with
Vikings
the King
went
of
over there
Leinster,
too.
he forms a pact with the king and Ulster, installing himself as High King of Ireland, while gaining some XP points along the way. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why would it be so easy for the Anglo-Saxons, who nearly faced annihilation a moment ago, to go off and form an actual empire within 20 years?
If they get the Danes to help.
Momentum in medieval warfare swung dramatically back and forth, at least prior to siege warfare. Things were really all or nothing.
Yeah, you bunker down, you rebuild. You know, with siege warfare, you could siege a place and it could never recover again. In these places, you could. Dude, that guy got an arrow right to the throat. Dang.
If Harold was able to not die on the battlefield, then who's to say how long and prosperous his reign could have been? He was elected for his skills as a warrior, after all. He inspired his men, and if he had a legitimate claim to take Denmark, I don't see why he wouldn't. War in this time was a gamble, and if you won big. But if you lost, then, well, when it comes to history, timing is everything.
All right, fair enough.
While William had an extended family, which ended up dominating Western Europe for the next few centuries, his personal legacy hinged all on the outcome at Hastings. And if he lost Hastings, then not shockingly, it wouldn't be good for him.
Well, again, this is assuming that, like, I guess it's assuming that the Normans never come back again. They just, like, give up forever. You know, we can't say that, you know, but again, it's alternate history, of course.
Brittany and Anjou were unstable. Aquitaine was busy with the Reconquista. But most importantly for William, his heir and the French king
that's gonna be
were
later,
both
though.
14 years old at the time. Enter Baldwin. No, not the cool-looking leopard dude. Baldwin the Fifth of Flanders, William's father-in-law, and
I love the cool one. What's the Baldwin face, or not the face because he had the mask, the like he did the hand thing. Gosh, I always forget. I forgot that I even covered a video about it.
royal regent. Before he dies a year later, perhaps he secures Normandy for his daughter, who also happened to be William's wife. And the king had a history of disinheriting children in order to expand his power. You have to remember that William took all of his loyal supporters with him.
Right.
So if he lost, Normandy would be pretty much defenseless.
Okay. That answers what I was saying if they didn't come back, but I didn't realize how much of just his whole, just like everybody left, the whole community that was following William left. I don't know, it was to that extent. So yeah, that makes sense that another threat wouldn't just be them trying to come back again.
Mention his 2 decades of territorial expansion pissed off a lot of noble lords. Say 14-year-old Robert goes off on a hunt, never to return. Now squabbling barons see their duchy sliced into pieces, with big chunks going to the French crown and the county of Flanders. Today, Philip is remembered as a conciliatory king who centralized the crown and built up its army, which is horrible news for the Normans. Does this mean that France gets centralized earlier than in our own history?
No.
Yeah, probably, but nothing too crazy.
That happens more effect of the Crusades as well. Because I wonder what impact this is going to have on the Crusades. Because that's, I mean, they're kind of going over because they're starting to get to the 1200s now.
Flanders and Aquitaine would still rival the crown when it came to finances and military strength, but the Norman administrative code would speedrun some aspects of bureaucracy. The biggest change here in this alternate timeline is the centuries of conflict between England and France, a defining fundamental part of two nations' history.
Is there 100 years war?
England.
There's a question. Would there be 100 years war?
Under the Normans always meddled in French affairs, as England was simply one part of a greater kingdom. William was a king of England, but also a subject to the French crown. Him messing in French affairs was annoying, but understandable. A foreign king intervening in France, however, is simply an invasion. And since the French had already built a ton of castles in the north, England doesn't stand a chance.
Okay.
I mean, sure, you can take the man out of the north, but you can't take the Norse out of the man.
Yeah.
Harold and his future descendants might launch a few pillaging campaigns, but there's never an attempt to hold French land like William did.
Yeah.
They'd have no legitimacy, no connection politically or otherwise to meddle in the mainland. Not now, not for a few centuries. Think about that. After William's defeat, the only land the English would have claim to in France would be Normandy, but that province would get gobbled up by the crown in Flanders.
It kind of happens anyways, you know, I mean, later on with the 100 Years' War, but yeah, I don't know, anyone come to their aid? I mean, if the Normans fall, does the rest of France actually just eat it up before the English do?
This is such a dramatic change to our history. It really changes the character of Western Europe. Like, there's no 100 Years' War, no Joan of Arc, no constant centuries of squabbling between these two kingdoms.
This does seem very
Instead, these two kingdoms would remain two separate foreign kingdoms, maybe going to war once in a while, but never for any legitimacy claims like the Normans had.
You never know, though. I mean, maybe some ruler that we had never even considered because it's a totally different timeline. I mean, it does get the bitten by the imperialism bug and crosses there and wants to cross the strait and then, you know, invade into mainland Europe. But, you know, well, there's really no point in arguing that.
England would focus its attention with its northern neighbors,
it would be completely random,
not the south. Perhaps if the Anglo-Saxons got their wish, they might maintain a North Sea empire. But whether they do or not, that original cultural connection between Scandinavia and the British Isles might continue on for centuries onward. Something that will certainly affect the very evolution of the English language itself. English is considered a Germanic language, but kind of like how Greenland is considered a part of North America.
That's what I was going to say. It's a mutt. English language is such a mutt of languages.
I mean, yeah, I guess. Where else would you really put it? But it doesn't feel like it. I mean, roughly 60% of our words come from Latin or French. No matter what study you use or how you compute it,
and just the conjugation of verbs
of English are a minority within the language. Like I mentioned earlier, the Normans fundamentally altered the English language. They simplified the hell out of it, to the point where Old English, nearly identical at one time to Old German, became unrecognizable over time,
pretty quickly,
evolving into New Middle English or Anglo-Norman. Inflections were reduced, the different forms of verbs reflecting mood, tense.
By the way, this still would have been a form of English that would be almost unrecognizable for us today.
And person were gone. Unique
Middle English, I mean, you're going to get a touch of it.
And noun gender assignment, present in many modern languages, was cut. All of this made English a malleable language, easy to learn. By connecting it to the Franco-Latin-speaking world, that region's science, art, and literature permeated throughout the Isle. The literature. How do you even describe alternate literature? You really can't, because it doesn't exist. How can we imagine how literature and culture in this place would be? I guess we kind of have to get creative. For one, Chaucer. Everyone knows Chaucer, the father of English literature. While he was instrumental in using the commoner language for writing,
just use a
unique
language.
thing in England despite being born 2 centuries after the conquest, his championing of the English language was still an English that had been transformed already by the Normans. Old English shifted into Middle, an English that was now riddled with French. Of course, 2 more centuries later, we would have Shakespeare, who wrote in early modern English.
Yeah. If you want to know about, like, at one point did English as we know it be able to be understood, or let me frame that again. At what point in history would people in England be speaking a form of English that we would probably understand? It's usually around, consider around Shakespeare's time, so Renaissance era.
But that language was already built upon the former's foundations. So what I'm getting at here is, what would this alternative English have been like without the Normans? Well, for one, it remains Germanic. This alternate England would move forward the next few centuries far more influenced by Scandinavian and North German culture than anything French, even if the whole North Sea Empire thing fell apart. Now, in the long term, this isn't as dramatic as you might think. It's not like England would remain a bunch of Vikings forever. Scandinavia didn't remain Vikings forever. One day, castles and knights may come, but with a northern flair. As much as I could rant about all of this, for the sake of timing, let's just say that in both language and culture, the North Sea would be very closely related. From an outside perspective, English wouldn't really sound that much different from languages like Danish, Dutch, Frisian, and Northern German.
That makes sense.
I guess really the best metaphor I can use for this is King Arthur. When you think of King Arthur, you probably imagine a noble king, fighting in a chivalrous fashion, leading a band of loyal knights. But the actual myth is old, very old. King Arthur is a figure rooted in the culture of the Welsh.
Isn't it almost, it would be considered to be like from the Roman era?
Figure that was a mythical hero that fought against the invading Anglo-Saxons. There was no round table, no divinely ordained leadership. He might not have even been a king. No matter what the origins of the original Arthur was,
I don't know anybody really
doesn't matter,
him to.
because what the legend of Arthur became was one molded by Norman culture. It smoothed out the edges of Arthur, made him more refined, one who acted in the Norman fashion, as that's what a true king of England was. The very elements we think of as Arthurian were later added on by the Normans. A version aimed to solidify the new status quo. Blood decided the leader, not some pagan Witton council. It was this version that almost
blood both ancestrally and through conquest
handedly created the hero's journey. While ironically Arthur began as a Welsh figure who fought off the Anglo-Saxons,
I did not know he was a Welsh figure.
Under the Anglo-Saxons, he could have transformed into a general mythical figure of England. Just one with more Viking elements, if you will. Perhaps this version of Arthur is more Beowulf than noble king. Something that kind of characteristic.
Something more Germanic in its feel, I guess. The vibes. That'd be cool though. Who's cooler, King Arthur? Who do you guys think's cooler, King Arthur or Beowulf? I think the Beowulf story's cooler.
An alternate England as a whole. The fact is, the Vikings had an enormous amount of stories to tell, most of which were lost to the ages, due to them writing their different runic system on wood or stone.
And when they converted to Christianity.
When the Anglo-Saxons, who generously funded monasteries, are actually given peace and prosperity? I think we might see Christian beliefs mixed in with pagan pantheons, much like how the Latin world incorporated former Roman and Greek myths. And so these stories, kind of lost to time, might be preserved. The foundational great works of art for England. Many more stories just like Beowulf, or the Exeter Book, and Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. Literature reflects the ideas of the contemporary writers.
I feel like he hasn't done a lot of these alternate literature takes from, I mean, I've seen a lot of videos now, but I think it's a cool thing to think about is, talk about that in the framework of changes in cultures with alternate history. This is kind of cool. I like this.
And since the culture isn't put into the same Franco-Latin blender as the rest of Europe, we might see some incredible stories that we otherwise never would have.
Well,
thanks, Norman. Thanks for
would.
everything. So, fun fact, I did one of those ancestry test things, and my ancestry map looks like this. 60% from southern England, but more specifically for this case, northern France.
Sure. I got a big chunk of that. Mine's English and German. And usually when it's English, you're going to see this circle around from connecting basically Normandy to southern England. So I have about equal parts of that circle there. And then the other part for me is southern kind of Germany. So Germany, Switzerland, that area. With sprinkled in, there's another about 10% that is Scandinavian.
My last name, by the way, is of Anglo-Norman origin. Oh God, did my ancestors commit war crimes against the Danish?
Yes.
Once again, special thanks to
if you are alive today, at some point you had ancestors that committed some kind of genocide. It's why you exist. As dark as that sounds. All right, final thoughts. All right, since I know so many of you are really into this time period and this region in history, I'm really looking forward to seeing your comments about what do you think about these hypotheses that is coming out in this video. I kind of gave my thoughts with what I know, but I definitely trust yours in this. How likely, again, do you think these hypotheses were? I'd love to hear from you. All right, again, thanks for hanging out with me. Look out for the upcoming History Showdown episodes, and we'll see y'all next time.